In a dark world where dreams turn into nightmares and secrets creep from the shadows of the night, prepare to face true horror. Hold your breath and prepare, because what you are about to witness is not for the faint of heart. Welcome to your journey into the depths of horror.
He was called Mark, an ordinary man on the surface, but inside he was boiling with an unnatural passion, a passion for blood. The story began when he was a child, where he first saw blood flowing from his brother's hand after a minor accident. He didn't feel fear as one would expect. Instead, he felt a strange excitement that he didn't understand at the time. As Mark grew older, so did his strange obsession. Watching gory movies was no longer enough. He wanted something real. Initially, he started with small things, inflicting minor cuts on himself to see the blood flow from his body. But that wasn't enough. He wanted something more, something that would give him the ultimate thrill he was seeking. One night, Mark went out into the dark streets, carrying a sharp knife in his pocket. His eyes gleamed with madness as he stalked his first prey. He saw a young man walking alone in a narrow alley and quietly approached him. Suddenly, he attacked, plunging his knife into the young man's body. He watched the blood gush out of the wound and felt an unprecedented thrill surge through his body. Mark didn't stop there. He watched his victim take their final breaths, reveling in the experience. The newspapers began reporting on a series of bloody crimes that terrified the city. He chose his victims carefully and killed them brutally, savoring every moment. He didn't kill just for the sake of killing. He enjoyed watching the terror in his victims' eyes as they saw their lives fade away before them. Over time, Mark became a terrifying legend that people in the city talked about. He had special rituals that he practiced after each crime. He would sit in a dark room in his house, surrounded by bloody photos he had taken of his victims. These rituals fueled his bloodlust and increased his madness. On one cold night, Mark decided to escalate his crimes. This time, he chose a different kind of victim, an innocent little girl playing in a nearby park. The girl was singing and laughing without a care in the world until Mark approached her with a frightening smile. In the blink of an eye, he kidnapped her and took her to an abandoned place. There, Mark began his gruesome ritual. The girl cried and screamed, but her cries reached no one. He started with a small cut, watching the blood slowly seep out, savoring every moment. Then he began to cut slowly and deliberately, taking pleasure in each slice, until the screams turned into desperate whispers before fading away completely. Afterwards, Mark sat back, gazing at her lifeless body with eyes filled with ecstasy, as if he were admiring a piece of art. The series of crimes continued, each more brutal than the last. The city began to live in a constant state of fear, with the streets becoming deserted as night fell. The police were working tirelessly to catch him, but Mark was clever enough to stay out of their grasp. On one grim night, Mark went out to find a new victim. This time, he chose a young couple who were strolling in a public park after dinner. The park was dark and quiet, the perfect place for him to indulge in his bloody hobby. With light steps, Mark approached the couple as they sat on a bench, talking quietly. Suddenly, with a swift strike, he pulled out his sharp knife and stabbed the young man in the chest. The girl screamed in terror and tried to run, but Mark was faster. He grabbed her and restrained her forcefully, then slowly cut her hand, savoring the sight of the blood flowing from her wound. Mark wasn't satisfied with just that. He continued to torture the girl and the young man, forcing them to watch each other bleed. Their screams pierced the quiet night, but there was no one to hear or rescue them. Mark sat beside them, observing the flowing blood and the terror in their eyes, as if he were watching a theatrical performance. Mark's madness grew with each passing moment. He began to slowly tear into his victims' bodies, savoring every cut and every drop of blood. Nothing could stop him or lessen his dark obsession. The night was long and filled with pain and terror for the couple, until they finally lost consciousness from the agony and blood loss. At dawn, Mark left their bodies in the park as a terrifying warning to the rest of the city. When passers-by discovered the bodies in the morning, the entire city was in a state of shock and horror. The police rushed to the scene, but there was no trace of Mark, who had disappeared once again into the darkness. The escalation in violence forced the police to intensify their efforts like never before. Investigators and experts from across the country were called in to assist in capturing this serial killer who had struck fear into everyone's hearts. However, Mark was always one step ahead, meticulously planning his next crime, carefully selecting his victims, and leaving behind a bloody message that mercy was unknown to evil. One night, after a period of cautious calm, Mark decided to commit an even bloodier act to demonstrate his strength and his ability to elude the police. This time, he chose a residential complex on the outskirts of the city, a place filled with families living in peace and security. Mark slipped into the residential complex, sneaking past the fences in the middle of the night. He headed towards one of the apartments he had been observing for days, where a small family lived. Quietly, he picked the lock and entered the house, making his way directly to the master bedroom. In that room, the father and mother were sleeping peacefully. Mark stood over the bed for a moment, savoring the scene of tranquility that would soon turn into a bloody nightmare. Then, with a swift strike, he stabbed the father in the neck, eliciting a terrified scream from the mother. She tried to defend herself, but Mark was faster and stronger. He stabbed her in the heart, causing her to collapse beside her husband. The young children heard the screams and woke up terrified. Mark rushed to their rooms and, without mercy, ended their small lives in a gruesome manner. There was no one to hear their cries on that cold night. Mark left behind a horrific crime scene and departed, heading into the darkness that had become his constant companion. In the morning, when the bodies were discovered, the town was in a state of indescribable panic. The news spread quickly, and everyone was wondering who the next victim would be. The pressure on the police increased incredibly. Special investigation teams, modern technology, and all possible resources were called in to catch Mark. However, despite all efforts, Mark remained in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. One day, Mark decided to try something new, something that would challenge him. He carefully chose his next victim, a police officer who was working on his case. This crime required meticulous planning and great audacity. Mark followed the officer for several days, learning his movements and daily routine. On a dark night, he executed his plan. He attacked the officer at his home in a swift and sudden assault. He gave him no chance to resist. It was a short and bloody struggle, ending with the officer's brutal murder. This crime was a direct challenge to the entire police force. Mark placed the officer's body in a prominent location, where everyone could see it, as a sign of his power and his ability to evade justice. The city began to boil with fear and anger after the officer's murder. The pressure on the police intensified, and newspapers were filled with shocking headlines about Mark, the killer who was undeterred by anything. People became afraid to go out at night, and everyone saw a potential threat in others. As Mark's notoriety grew, so did his arrogance and madness. He decided to escalate his challenge to the police and society. He planned an unprecedented crime, one that defied all standards of humanity. This crime targeted a public event, where people would gather in a large square to celebrate a local occasion. That night, Mark infiltrated the event, blending in with the crowd. His eyes gleamed with the thrill of madness, and his knife was hidden within the folds of his clothes. He had a meticulous plan, which he began executing with calculated steps. He approached the stage where important figures were seated, including the mayor and police leaders. In a moment of recklessness, Mark leaped onto the stage, attacking the mayor first. Screams echoed everywhere as people fled in all directions. Mark viciously wounded the mayor, watching blood gush heavily from his open wounds. Those moments only fueled his madness further. The screams reverberated across the square, and chaos engulfed the place. People ran in all directions, stumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to escape the horror that had befallen them. Amidst the mayhem, Mark stood, his eyes gleaming with madness, his knife glinting in the dim light. He stabbed the mayor again, inflicting a deeper wound, reveling in every drop of blood that spilled. The police were prepared for emergencies, but they did not anticipate this ferocious attack. Officers rushed towards the stage, trying to rescue the mayor and apprehend Mark. However, Mark was ready for them too. He pulled out a hand grenade from his pocket and threw it into the crowd. The explosion was massive, blood and debris scattered everywhere. Blood covered the square, and the screams didn't cease. Some officers were injured, while others tried to regain control amidst the chaos. However, Mark was at the height of his madness. He began chasing people in the square, stabbing and killing mercilessly. Each victim that fell only fueled his frenzy further. In a corner of the square, there was a young officer named Jack, determined to stop this nightmare at any cost. He saw Mark approaching a group of terrified children. Without hesitation, Jack rushed towards Mark, colliding with him forcefully. The knife fell from Mark's hand, and Jack quickly drew his weapon, firing several shots that killed Mark instantly, ending his criminal rampage. Calm replaced the chaos, but the signs of terror were evident everywhere. Scattered bodies, blood staining the ground, and the shocked faces of those who had survived. People gathered around Jack, thanking him for his bravery, but his eyes scanned the crowds, searching for any hint of another threat. The police began to secure the scene, collect the bodies, and transport the wounded to hospitals. The mayor, who was seriously injured, was quickly taken to the hospital for urgent treatment. The city slowly started to return to normalcy, but the effects of the terror and the crime were deeply engraved in everyone's memory. Jack, who overnight became the city's hero, felt the weight of responsibility and the pain from everything he had witnessed. He didn't seek fame. He only wanted to protect people from the brutality of someone like Mark. Each passing night, he returned home, sitting alone in the darkness, replaying the events in his mind, trying to understand how an ordinary person could transform into a bloodthirsty monster. The city began its recovery, but it knew it would never be the same. The terror brought by Mark would not be easily forgotten, and his name became synonymous with absolute evil. Children were afraid to walk the streets at night, and adults looked with unease at every unfamiliar face they